Greetings everyone, my name is Dr. Jason Freeman. I'd like to welcome you all to my channel. In recent weeks, right-wing protests have erupted across Britain in response to misinformation surrounding the murder of 3 young British girls by a 17-year-old in the seaside resort town of Southport in England. The misinformation surrounding the religion and migration status of the assailant, Axel Rudakabana. False reports identified him as a Muslim migrant when in fact he was neither Muslim nor a migrant, being born in Cardiff in Wales, which is part of Britain. In this video, I discuss the rise of right-wing outrage and protests with Dr. Edson Burton, a writer and historian based in Bristol, England, where some of the protests have occurred. So, without further ado, let's begin. Awesome. Well, again, thank you for doing this. I really am looking forward to kind of get your insights into what's happening over in Britain and really the larger trend of kind of the right wing kind of rhetoric that we're seeing across Europe. And so I just want to start with a basic question. So we're seeing these anti-migrant riots in Liverpool and Bristol. What are you all seeing on the ground? So what is maybe not being covered in the media? So what's really going on over there right now?
I think mainstream media has, I think, fairly well screened what has been going on.
Okay.
I think what's the complexity is more around what is the motivation,
Yeah.
how far back is this? So to give some sense of context, we had Brexit, which again was the sort of fears around British identity, migration, legal migration.
Hmm.
Now, since then, legal migration hasn't paused, but if anything,
Okay.
migration has
Okay.
increased from other parts of the world, but not from Europe. We've ended the free flow of migrants. But in a sense, the Tory party has focused in particular around illegal migration.
Hmm.
So this is migrants coming from France, mostly through Calais and taking small boats. And it's a
Actually,
Europe.
just some context. So for like American viewers who don't necessarily know Tory, labor, all that stuff. So the Tory party would be the equivalent of what do you think in the
The
US
Tory
or
party would be equivalent to the Republican
okay.
Party,
Okay, that's okay.
and it would go from a center ground to also its much more right-wing
Yeah.
element. Um, but most of the party, and what we're looking at the moment is that the Tory party, which had a strong tradition of centrist pragmatic thinking,
Hmm.
has become, in some ways, moved more to the right. And there have been key figures within that party
Hmm.
that have tried to push the party to the right. So, as in the US, and I think with Trump, what you have on the right is, or in the right wing area of politics, is a very energized base that is using these ideas of the left behinds, the blue collar people that have been losing out. So, where in the US, it's the idea of the wall stopping people coming from Latin America.
Hmm.
For us, it's this notion that people are crossing the Mediterranean and then trying to make their way into Europe and then through France, in particular, to Britain. And from the British lens, the irony is there is whether or not, and the rhetoric that is played is whether the French are really pulling their weight in
Okay.
trying to prevent this. So you both have a sense of European cooperation, but also tensions between Europe and Britain when it comes to migration, and also countries feeling that, for example, in Italy,
Hmm.
that people are not doing their fair share. So these migrants often landing in Greece and Italy as the first port of call. So it's a problem for the left too, because
Hmm.
of course the left want to avoid right-wing rhetoric, racist rhetoric,
Hmm.
um, but also want to court the blue collar vote. They've lost that blue collar vote, and hence the reason why, until this election, the sense that the Tories had used immigration effectively
Yeah.
to win over seats that would never have gone to Labour. Now, context to this in particular is that the small boat crossing is infinitesimal when it comes to the actual numbers of people or the actual impact it makes on Britain's demographic. But it's as if it's a wedge issue because of Brexit, if anything,
Hmm.
that we know that immigration is a powerful card to play and has been effectively played since the early 1900s,
Yeah.
revived in 1961 and 1964, where, in a sense, both parties began to speak similar languages around immigration. One, though, for the sake of community cohesion, but on their Tory right to preserve British identity. So what we have then is this return to immigration as one of the few wedge issues where, in other ways, the parties are fairly united
Okay.
around fiscal policy and around law and order and other aspects of governance where we've
Hmm.
seen parties converge.
Okay.
And so the appearing to be soft on immigration or tough on immigration then plays well electorally.
Yeah.
But the problem you then have is, of course, that you can never be right wing enough when it comes to immigration if you play that game.
Yeah.
And so the Tories have found themselves outflanked by a new movement called Reform, which, if anything, was probably quite decisive in them losing key numbers of seats
Yeah.
by splitting their vote.
Hmm.
Um, and in a sense, again, moving people away from a real statistical analysis of what's at stake when it comes to these small boat crossings. The language of left behinds is kind of key to this too,
Okay.
but we don't really know how much those who are involved in the riots are genuinely from those communities. And I say that because Britain had an issue with, you call it soccer, we'd say football,
Hmm.
but we had an issue with hooliganism that was associated with our soccer and soccer firms.
Hmm.
And that actually drew from a broad um, strata of white men,
Yeah.
mostly white men, but not exclusively. There were firms, as we call them,
Hmm.
within the parlance of hooliganism that
Okay.
existed before. So, in a sense, there has been a kind of reactivation of some of the energy which was seduced by the far right National Front movements,
Hmm.
those at the more extreme end. Um, so I don't know, just to perhaps to clarify then, what I'm suggesting is that the lack of caution and the more extreme language within the political mainstream has, I think, fueled the language at the margins, the
Okay.
language at the far right. And if anything, it's played to narratives of migrants taking over the country, but also that they're being dealt a hand, which is discriminatory actually to the white British population. That
Okay.
white working class people feel neglected, feel invisible, and their
Hmm.
concerns not taken seriously when they are bearing the brunt of migration, bearing the brunt of asylum seekers living in the country.
Okay.
Now, that's the narrative that is being used and played with by the far right. And of course, it's one which camouflages the fact that their agenda it has been much more protracted than these current kind of flashpoints and discussion exists. So it
Okay.
becomes a great way of a recruiting ground for people for a particular lens and a particular view of Britishness that actually has been fairly consistent on the far right,
Okay.
but now can be galvanized by these moments of misinformation and protest. But that the fault for that misinformation needs, I think, also to include the center. Sorry, when I say the center, not the center. The center has shifted to the right,
Yeah.
but what we might call the mainstream, which
Okay.
doesn't look like the mainstream of, you know, political discourse of the 90s, you could say.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
So the context, I think, also, which is important for to hear in the US is that our media has often concentrated on crimes committed by people of color
Yeah.
and crimes committed by people of migrant status
Hmm.
then also become a way of dog whistling that not that a particular migrant or a particular person has committed it, but aren't they suspect, aren't they?
Yeah, like
Are
a
we
group,
letting
a
in
group,
a
essentially.
group?
Yeah.
Yes. And so the what's happened in our streets can be traced, not traced. So this is how it's so careful how one has to create a narrative.
Hmm.
But at least let's talk about chronology anyway. Um, a young man, very disturbed, um, goes to uh, dance class,
Yeah.
Taylor Swift dance
Taylor
class,
Swift,
and
yeah, themed.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so you know the context of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But the wider story to that and why that plays is, of course, there has been a narrative that has been put forward like this previously.
Hmm.
And so this is now seen as a tipping point if you reanimate these kind of discussions that happened before,
Okay.
that the working class has been neglected. Um, and then in the parallel truth world, which I don't occupy,
Yeah.
of course, you get
Mhm.
that. And I'm trying not to other these people because I think they're a complex
Yeah, it's like a
mishmash of
lot more
very different.
nuance to the conversation than
Yeah.
like just these angry white hooligans who have,
Yeah.
just like, like,
And
yeah,
and some will be,
yeah.
some will be people who are used to reactivating and saying the whole hooligan
Hmm.
movements.
Yeah.
Some live in a parallel world in which they genuinely feel some sort of existential threat.
Yeah.
Um, there are people who are having the trauma of particular flashpoints, whether it's been Rotherham and um, uh, sex exploitation rings,
Hmm.
and how those rings have involved people of color,
Hmm.
Pakistani men.
Yeah.
But this idea then that that is unique to Asian communities.
Hmm.
Um, so there's a whole mixture of things going on here. And the only thing I would say, which is by no means a vindication, but I think one of the challenges we have on the left is to talk about intersectionality
Hmm.
and how we balance our concerns, how we need to have clarity, I think, around justice
Yeah.
um, for all.
Hmm.
And if we don't, or then you can easily be gained. But that justice for all, if we look at leveling up and we're looking at, so we've had this agenda that the white, blue collar people have been left behind.
Hmm.
And so they need to be supported. The annoying thing about that, and the misguided notion of that, is that in terms of exploitation, then we know that women are exploited by predatory men
Yeah.
of all colors.
Yes.
We know, of course, that deprived communities are deprived across color lines.
Hmm.
But where culturally they may have differences, they cannot see the mutuality of their deprivation.
Yeah.
But electorally, it plays very well to create a sense of dog whistle
Yeah.
that we will look out for you because the other lot on the left aren't.
Yeah, and we see the
Um,
same see the same thing here. So we have kind of like the whole idea of the deplorables, like the right wing deplorables, and that's been used to kind of as kind of like those left wing people are trying to oppress you. They don't really like you, and therefore on the right wing, Trump, like we care about you really. When economically, as you kind of mentioned in Britain, like you have these groups that are in the same place economically, but they're kind
yeah,
of played against each other. We the same exact thing here. So
yeah,
you have economically depressed African American communities, Hispanic communities, Asian communities, white communities who are, would benefit from the same policies, but the racial dog whistles is like they're the problem. Like it's the immigration, it's the replacement theory idea that somehow they're gonna come and demographically they're gonna unseat you and take over that type of thing. So yeah, we see the exact same thing on this side of the pond as well.
Yeah. And the irony of but again, the lack of uh, academic, or I
Hmm.
don't want to even say academic, but the lack of clarity around this, of course, is that the focus on immigration, illegal immigration,
Hmm.
suggests that it's far bigger a problem, or it has a much bigger demographic impact than it actually can do
Yeah.
and does. So again, I think the far right know this, but they know that this is a ground in which they can open up that gulf between,
Hmm.
and then there's a wider agenda which is around who is British.
Yes.
And that will move very quickly, not just from asylum seekers, but to all the other people of color.
Hmm.
And also, of course, while it's convenient to play Islamophobia, we know from the history of these groups that it's equally anti-Semitic
Yeah.
and also, of course, anti-LGBT queer rights as well.
Yeah.
So I think if I'd say one failing of the media is to perhaps to try and disentangle um, some of this rhetoric.
Yeah.
And also our mainstream media treads carefully, but has tried to grill politicians about whether or not they feel any degree of responsibility for talking intemperately
Hmm.
about immigration
Yeah.
and so on. But of course, we live in such a litigious age
Yeah.
that even that, while on the ground, you feel, of course, damn right, if you keep telling everyone that illegal immigration is an issue, if every time in the news the small boats become almost a top point, when
Hmm.
in fact there's much greater issues confronting us,
Hmm.
daily,
Yeah.
then of course people's sense of perspective goes out of kilter. Um, and is it the cart before the horse? Are these concerns on immigration genuinely as they appear, or are they, in a sense, being um, dredged up and pushed because there's a thin ground really between political
Mhm.
parties, and they are looking for those areas of difference, looking to embarrass each other,
Yeah.
looking to create division, just as we know that the current conflict in Gaza has
Yeah.
been a real headache for the Labour Party as well,
Yeah.
um, which it perhaps doesn't uh, isn't for the right, whether both in the US and here, um, which can ally very clearly. Um, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also see the issues with like trans rights being kind of used in that same way. Kind of, it's one of those things that is kind of used like a dog whistle, like every, kind of just to kind of attack the left and things like that. And so even like minor things get a lot of coverage within the media. So I guess I have another question. So, in regards to these most recent riots, are they mainly just focused on migrants, or would you say they're broader like racial riots? So, like in the U.S., we have an interesting dynamic where you have, racial issues and immigration issues, and sometimes they're coupled and sometimes they're separate. And even within the African American community, you get some xenophobia, this idea that the Hispanic immigrants are going to come in, and take over jobs, that type of thing. Do you see us? Are those riots there mainly like, it's anti-immigrant, like specifically non people from other countries, or is it kind of more broadly focused on anyone who is non-white and British, whether they're native or from other places?
And here's the complexity. They
Hmm.
are, I think, in the minds of those who participate,
Hmm.
they are a mixed and complex bunch.
Okay.
There are people who are anti-immigrant. There are people who are. So to give you a sense of the kind of I say the British mind, but
Hmm.
apologize. I
Okay.
apologize for such a broad kind of generalization. But there may be people who feel that multiculturalism is great. They like the
Hmm.
diversity of the neighborhood, but the country is very small. We need
Yeah.
to do something about immigration.
Okay.
Um, and within that, when you scrape away the layers, there may be racism, but there may not be.
Hmm.
There may be this idea that, there's something about the national character that's changing,
Okay.
or that resources are being consumed.
Hmm.
Then you have ideologues who are both cruder and smarter, as we've seen the right evolve over the years.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And the cruder ones, well, it's about whiteness
Hmm.
and it's anti-immigration. Um, but also the more subtle ones will recognize, of course, that when your national football team contains heroes of color,
Yeah.
that to be so openly racist against people of color it's not going to be much, not going to get much success in terms of
Yeah.
recruitment. But on the other hand, what it then comes down to in a more complex way is these ideas of culture and cultural racism.
Hmm.
Um, so people of color are okay if they love England, love the flag, love Great Britain,
Yeah.
don't
Assimilate,
attack it,
basically.
assimilate.
Yeah.
Um, and they wouldn't use that language. But
Hmm.
the sense of, we're still in the chapter of post Black Lives Matter,
Yeah.
post the discussions about decolonization.
Hmm.
And this unease around how people of color have probed British history. But it has not always been understood. And that misunderstanding still exists today. Um, in the sense, to give you an example of what happened
Hmm.
after the Colston statue was taken down,
Yeah.
we have a war memorial in the center of our city in Bristol.
Hmm.
And a group of mostly white men gathered around that war memorial to protect it. And they thought that that would be under attack.
Yeah.
And I remember a good friend of mine, uh, Black British Caribbean descent,
Hmm.
went and spoke to some of them. And they felt that, after Black Lives Matter, that Black people were against all aspects of British history and that, we wanted to take down everything that they felt they were proud of.
Yeah.
And Britain harks back to this unifying time of World War II,
Hmm.
and hence Churchill as the kind of the icon of World War II becomes
Yeah.
a much protected figure,
Hmm.
a site of contestation. Whereas, of course, uh, a historian will know that it's much more complex when it comes to Churchill
Yeah.
because of class,
Hmm.
um, and his approach to policing working class people, miners in particular.
Yeah.
Um, but that's the chapter we're still in. This idea that white culture is under threat, and that actually an alternative culture, an alien culture, whether people cite it as Islam or whether they cite it as a anti-proud movement, an anti-British movement,
Yeah.
that too is much more is also thrown into the mix of this anti-immigrant rhetoric.
Yeah.
How do we protect British history? Because they don't want us to be proud. And of course, again, when in a parallel truth world, no one is speaking to each other. And the more complex ideas around the more complex understanding of what Black Lives Matter, but also what people of color, and not just people of color, people on the left,
Hmm.
are trying to do with British history to probe it, to ask questions,
Yeah.
to come up with a history that's fit for purpose for all people, white,
Yeah.
black, working class, and so on. I think that's not articulated. And it's certainly not in the interests of people on the right, whether it's on the right mainstream or on the far right,
Hmm.
to, in a sense, present anything other than a caricature of that work that's being done
Yeah.
actually within our heritage centers and in
Hmm.
our grassroots communities as well.
Yeah.
And it's easier to live in this parallel world, live in a world of online truth
Hmm.
when people are not also living in proximity. So Britain, in many of its urban spaces, but not all, people live multiculturalism. They have
Yeah.
relationships.
Hmm.
which in a sense are the alternative to looking over there, just imagining what people think. You
Hmm.
live and experience the complexity of Black, British, and other lives to
Yeah.
enough an extent to know that people get on by and large.
Yeah.
But outside of these urban spaces, actually, there are many parts of the countries where there's a very tiny people of color demographic. And there
Yeah.
are communities where there are um, larger demographics, so some of our northern cities,
Hmm.
but where communities mix less,
So I think
which
about
maybe,
Newcastle is one example of like a place I've been. I mean, it's a
yeah,
city, but it definitely did not feel as diverse as Birmingham
mm,
or Bristol or London.
yeah, yeah. And in those senses, then, um, so there was a report done years ago by someone called Ted Cantle,
Hmm.
and Ted Cantle, the Community Cohesion Report,
Yeah.
was interrogating the reasons for riots in um, Britain's cities.
Yeah.
And these were riots in particular by Asian, that arose from Asian communities. And one of the
Yeah.
things that Ted Cantle's report was saying is that people were living in proximity, but there was no connection, no connectivity.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay.
And so the white working class and brown working class couldn't see their mutual conflicts, their
Yeah.
mutual exclusions, hence what I was mentioning earlier. A city like Bristol is more complex
Okay.
because people tend to satellite and move around enough to have a more complex interaction, where it's harder to maintain or create or foment those kind of mythologies.
Hmm.
But Bristol's been on a journey,
Yeah.
it would have been more like that in the 70s. And what we have here is a very strong um, left activist community. So when we thought last week there was going to be a far right presence,
Yeah.
then thousands of people turned up um, to do a counter demonstration. And
Okay.
that's always been the case whenever the EDL or far right have come to the city.
Hmm.
They've been far outnumbered by a very quickly mobilized coalition of left wing groups,
Okay. Okay.
anti-fascist groups, but also a trade union movement that is still strong here,
Hmm.
and a range of other groups that come together, as well as, and I think when we're talking about, cities like Bristol, it begins in the center and just moves left.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. So
Okay.
it's quite it's a very different proposition to some of the other cities in the country.
I hope you're enjoying the video, but before we go any further, I just want to quickly shout out my Patreon page, Dr. Jason Freeman Reacts. On the page, I have full, unedited reactions from movies such as the classic 1995 film, Dead Presidents, and the 2020 film, A Quiet Place Part 2. I also have reactions for entire seasons of shows, including Season 2 of House of the Dragon, and the first season of Doctor Who on Disney+, starring Ncuti Gatwa and Millie Gibson. And for those of you who purchase my highest tier, you'll be receiving a few tokens of my appreciation, including a mug, a tote bag, and some clothing with a Diaspora Dispatch logo designed by yours truly. To get access to all this, just go to my Patreon page and sign up for one of the tiers. You can find a link for it in the description of this video, or just type patreon.com/DRJASONFREEMAN. Thank you for listening. Now back to the video. Okay, okay. So one of the narratives, I know in the US and I'm assuming in Britain as well, is that this kind of racism, anti-migrant sentiment has gotten worse in recent years. So here we link it to Trumpism. So the rise of Trump in 2016 after the Obama administration. So it's kind of like this kind of insurgent, this right-wing insurgents. Um, but I think, when we think about the longer history, I mean, it's always been there. And it's almost like it's more of a narrative. So have you noticed, like from say, in Bristol or Britain at large in the 80s and 90s, do you think it's worse now, or do you think it's been kind of more continuous over the decades in regards to this anti-migrant, maybe racist sentiment?
I think when you take a longer view,
Hmm.
I think one of the problems we kind of struggle with is we have a notion of progress,
Yeah.
that history moves along this smooth path upwards
Hmm.
towards tolerance, inclusivity,
Yeah.
open-mindedness, global identities, and so on.
Hmm.
Um, and I think then it's more the case that we have actually moved radically from politics of the 60s and 70s,
Yeah.
even within our mainstream discourse. But that since Brexit and the rise of a particular populism, we have a reinvigoration of kinds of discourses around migration that we have not seen since the 60s and
Hmm.
70s. Um, but that is not to, and that sits in a much more complex place now, I think, than it did in the 60s and 70s, because it also sits within a multicultural society.
Hmm.
Um, a multicultural society that no one thinks they can unravel in a way that I think in the 60s and 70s was, well, if we could, repatriation was something
Yeah.
that was mooted.
Hmm.
These ideas of somehow kind of holding the line. That isn't the case. We know that. But the reinvigoration of this seems more around a crisis of British identity. But
Okay.
again, I would say that it's a cyclical crisis of
Yeah.
British identity. That crisis happened after decolonization in the 40s when Britain was no longer an empire, sorry, in the post-war period.
Hmm.
Um, a completely out of kilter sense of loss of identity when Caribbean migration was happening in the 60s because the numbers were
Hmm.
looking at the vast numbers of British people,
Yeah.
um, infinitesimal.
Yeah.
Um, and now it's, yes, we are much more multicultural society, but nonetheless, it is not about the numbers. It then focuses more on the sense of is British identity something which people feel they're losing? But
Okay.
what is it they're losing? A sense of nostalgia again is being revoked.
Hmm.
Um, as I think another generation pushes for a new journey of civil rights,
Hmm.
new journeys of inclusion, interrogates British history anew,
Yeah.
then we have this backlash. Um, and at the same time, we have more people in actually the mainstream political parties, both political parties of color.
Hmm.
So, but this is where cultural racism still has its power and impact,
Yeah.
regardless of that, because now the narrative is around what you say and how you belong.
Okay.
Um, that defines where you stand in Britishness
Okay.
rather than just color. But that too is in the mix as well.
So like ideologically, if you are on the left, it's like almost like you're anti-British or not really British. That's kind of that sentiment is that to be British means you have to be almost like not jingoistic, but like you have to be all in. Like you can't be super critical of the society.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And I think again, it's every time there is a push
Yeah.
and there is a pushback,
Hmm.
the sense of threat. And rather than having a nuanced conversation about these continuing problematic um, elements of British culture, we built Britishness so much around imperialism.
Yeah.
Um, and that isn't the case for the left, a left that sees British history also in terms of the clash of classes,
Hmm.
in terms of the boldness of working class movements. But within this right wing jingoistic element, it's British identity is very much associated with dominance,
Yeah.
with imperialism, with being in control, with notions of glory.
Yeah.
And when those things seem out not fit for purpose for both for black kids and white kids, and not just kids, but
Yeah. Just
for
people.
people
Yeah.
growing up, just people in general, when those things are contested, then that jingoism is reanimated.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like it's not gone away. It's just that when you push, you see what's under the surface.
Just like bubbling there and just kind of
Yeah,
reanimates as you mentioned over and over again. And we again we see the same thing here because like we had the civil rights movement and then we had the Reagan years, and then we had the Obama years, and then we had the Trump. So it's kind of like, yes, that's even during like the civil rights era, during the Obama, it's always there, that kind of sentiment, and then something happens and it kind of gets reanimated, reinvigorated.
Yeah, and I think the fundamental, I guess, problem is how white people or a class of people define their identity
Yeah,
differently, not in terms of control, power, and dominance, and also come to an understanding of history, which in a sense can hold both the painful problematics of how that history was achieved, how wealth
yeah,
was achieved, how power was achieved, um, can hold that and at the same time create a new narrative.
yeah,
And it feels in a sense that we are stuck in an impasse.
yeah,
That ironically that we haven't really managed to shift a narrative forward, both between hypercriticality, but also between hyperdefensiveness.
hmm,
And that the work is to create something which looks to the future, acknowledging the past, but also looks at a wider sense of what Britishness is and has
yeah,
been. But it has been so often associated with, I wouldn't say even has been so often, but there's critical points in history, I think, which people hark back to,
hmm,
and use and weaponize the past around particular structures and times.
yeah,
So this notion of the unity of World War One and Two,
hmm,
which of course doesn't we talk about the class tensions, um, and that what are given as national heroes, maybe class heroes.
yeah,
So the ongoing work of what it is to be British, what it is to be American, I think it is still in a sort of a crisis point,
yes,
and that we'll find ourselves recircling and circling around these flashpoints and so on until I think serious work is done by political leadership to create new narratives.
yeah.
Um, yeah,
And that was gonna be my last question. It's like, how do we move past this impasse? And do you think, because of course there was the shift from the Tories to the Labour Party in regards to the Prime Minister. So like, do you think that it will happen on the governmental level, or do you think it has to be more grassroots in regards to moving past this impasse, to be a much more inclusive society, or at least a narrative that is more inclusive?
there is a sense. So one has to. We've come at a period of austerity, which
Mhm.
has seen people's economic fortunes, sense of prospects and hope plummet.
Yeah,
But we've also had historically um, the exclusion of certain classes of people in areas that have been disinvested in. Um, Now, as long as those economic imbalances remain, then people that have more in common can be gained by people who will gain from gaming them.
like demagogues, basically.
Yeah. Um, but it's not just the demagogues, but in electoral terms,
Hmm.
because it's such a wedge issue and identity is such a wedge issue and immigration thrown into that, then unless we have a consensus around where we will not go, and it may be that that actually needs to be enforced, that
Hmm.
incitement to rate to hatred needs to be much stronger. And
Hmm.
I personally, I think, we've allowed politicians in the mainstream to say things that have made extremism normal.
Yeah,
And on the grass and on the ground, of course, it means that it becomes a dangerous time at particular flashpoints
yeah.
for people who are perceived as outliers, right?
Okay.
I think some of that conversation, I do believe in robust democracy. And I think sometimes when you're so concerned with freedom of speech, you make people who actually don't have the power and ability to defend themselves incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah.
So I think we need a consensus around what is right language in politics,
Yeah.
but we also need a new deal for people who are in deprivation,
Yeah.
in fear of the hopelessness, can't see a future.
Hmm.
Um, and and these are people, regardless of race. Um, these are people of, I think, yeah, of color and not of color. And I think that means that we have to be honest about balancing up. So much of the wealth in our country is tied up in the South,
Yeah.
and it doesn't move even to the Southwest,
Hmm.
nor to the northern cities. Um,
And so just for
so
context, so like London, like is that one that like where you have a huge amount of wealth kind of in the
yeah,
southern part of Britain? Yeah.
yeah, huge amount of wealth.
Yeah.
And and what we've gone through is we've moved from an industrial economy to a service economy.
Yeah.
Um, and what happened, there wasn't a new deal for some of those communities that were formerly industrial. And we have this aspirational get on your bike, everyone can make it, borrowing from the US.
Yeah.
But of course, this is a sort of a fiction for people who have lived in areas which was almost mono-industrial.
Yeah.
And now those new service industries cannot soak up the employment needs.
Yeah.
So you have generations of deprivation, areas that still need so much support and injection.
Hmm.
And so an industrial strategy that aims to spread wealth and skills around the country
Hmm.
is kind of what we need.
Yeah.
And then I think it's the work of culture um, and academics to um, how do I say the broad group of all of us
Hmm.
who are in a position to change the national conversation
Yeah.
um, and to do so intersectionally. I do think that, and this is no means a causality thing, it's not a causality at all. Um, but we have to also, I think, on the left, think in terms of deprivation and think of how deprivation and a sense of lacking cultural capital sits with people regardless of their racial background.
Yeah.
Um, when we talk of empowerment, we have to think of the particular kinds of exclusions that happen to people of color
Yeah.
and also be mindful of the particular exclusions that happen to white working class people,
Hmm.
um, to queer people, and so on.
Yeah.
What we have to be very mindful of is that we hold these things together
Hmm.
and that when we're thinking of our city, that we have a strategy that works for the city in terms of deprivation and
Yeah.
people who feel excluded. If we don't do that, then we open the door to again those kind of
The kind of
demagogues.
the wedge politics and
Yeah,
yeah, turning
absolutely.
groups against each other.
Yeah, and um, and I think quite understandably on the left, you go where you feel is most urgent.
Hmm.
Asylum seekers
Yeah.
have in many ways been are so deprived, and I don't think people who are anti-asylum really understand just how vulnerable and fragile the lives of people who are looking for asylum are,
Yeah.
how, in a sense, degraded they are.
Hmm.
Um, so, understandably, um, concerned citizens go to where the most urgent need is when
Yeah.
people face destitution. But we have to find a way and a language for doing that that also looks at destitution and poverty in other spaces.
It's more
You know,
inclusive, essentially. More inclusive of a broader range of society.
yeah, I think it's kind of thinking what society do we want? You know,
Hmm.
if we really think in terms of social mobility and access and so on, then we have to hold these things together. From my personal experience as a Black British
Hmm.
working class born kid,
Yeah.
who've gone into spaces and now feel comfortable in those spaces. I don't think about going to an art house cinema or a theater place and think I'm the only black guy who's going to be there, or
Hmm.
is any going to brothers and sisters going to be there. Yeah,
Yeah.
it'll be nice, but I'm coming to see a film. I
Hmm.
don't feel an invisible barrier or question or
Hmm.
need permission.
Yeah.
And what has really landed with me in the last so many years is seeing white working class friends say that I can't go into that space. That space is not for me.
Yeah.
I'm an imposter. I shouldn't be here.
Hmm.
And I'm turning around thinking, what's your problem? You, you're white. You can go into this
Yeah.
place. And of course, then you start to think, okay, um, there are levels. We the levels of exclusion that I didn't realize. Um, and if your education system has geared you towards seeing that people with power talk like this,
Yeah.
have this kind of wealth,
Hmm.
it's not me,
Yeah.
then those people are too looking for their heroes.
Hmm.
And this is where they are so dangerously gamed by
Hmm.
people who will claim to be from them, who
Yes.
may have absolutely nothing in common with them at all
Hmm.
whatsoever. But
Yeah.
I'm your man. I look like you. And when I'm ready, I can pretend to sound like you.
Yeah.
And
Basically
here's
what
that.
basically what Trumpism here in the US is the same idea.
Absolutely.
The
It's the
upper
same.
class New York millionaire or billionaire or whatever he is. I'm like you, working class person or lower income person in Appalachia, when no, not at all.
Yeah,
On any level.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so in a sense, it then becomes a case of, a conversation between classes of white people
Hmm.
and people who feel excluded looking for a voice that they feel is legitimately representative. And the problem is that, those voices that may emerge are highly seductive, but they
Hmm.
will never deliver. And
No.
that's the tragedy of populism.
Yeah.
They will never deliver because, of course, you know, a few boats coming across the Mediterranean is incredibly, and into Calais, very dangerous for those people,
Hmm.
but they are not depriving areas of the country that have been deprived for
Yeah.
over 50 years. They are not making a dent
Hmm.
in terms of the prospects of the people in those areas,
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we kind of, and sadly, we live in a populist cycle as
Yeah.
people lose hope
Hmm.
and then are seduced by populists and then are disappointed with populists and then move back to mainstream solutions.
Yeah.
Um, and I do think, when we think around the replacement industries that have into place, I think workers need protection. I
Hmm.
think that the job of government is to look at our successful global companies and successful for who? We have people being fed an ideology of we can all make it and
Hmm.
we're these aspirational beings. But people they know that unless they're inheriting wealth,
Yeah.
they will never own and they will just about pay their rent.
Hmm.
We're in a dangerous situation and it's got nothing to do with sorry, it has to do with politics,
Yeah.
but it also has to do with how the choices we make and where wealth is going in this
Yeah.
country
Hmm.
and in both countries.
Yeah.
Um, and it's again, people without hope are vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I say without hope, it's not like we're walking around with heads down, but I think there is at the back of one's psychology a sense that I will not reach the same place as what I see on the TV.
Yeah.
I want to be Trump, and Trump is telling me I can be Trump. I want to be
Hmm.
Farage. I want
Hmm.
to be Boris.
Yeah.
But, you know, But you kind of know if things stay as they are, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And so thank you. Definitely that was a great conversation. Definitely learned a lot and kind of and hopefully it kind of puts a lot of stuff in context for the audience who's going to
Yeah,
see this. And so as stuff happens, as stuff, I may reach out to you again to kind of see and kind of get some more context and have some more conversations going forward. So thank you so much.
no problem. A pleasure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, if you found that conversation interesting and or informative, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Also, please share this video. And if you have any questions about the right-wing protests in England, please leave those in the comment section below. Thank you all for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day.